Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episodes number 141 and 142. I'm being lazy and recording one introduction to two videos, but it's a two-parter, and my guest in these two episodes, part 1 and 2, is Dr. Tiffeny Todd. And Dr. Todd got her PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, and presently is a department chair and associate professor of physics at Pierce College in Washington State. And Tiffany reached out to me and wanted to share a theory that she's working on, and it was part of her PhD thesis, and it's a non-local theory of consciousness. So we have two chapters, two episodes to unpack her work. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I really had a good conversation with her, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Tiffeny Todd to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm just going to say to the audience that a lot of you have subscribed, my subscribers, because of philosophy of mind, consciousness studies, maybe cognitive science, and Dr. Todd's here to talk about things within that domain. And this is going to be one of those conversations that to me is just sort of a benchmark, you know, and I say all this not so much to hype, but I'm just really happy to present her work and go back and forth and have some ideas shared on this particular conversation. Now, I will say that I will be granting space to Tiffany to just share her idea, and then we'll have a little back and forth. This will be a part one of two parts that will be recorded. Part one will be slightly more monologic. It will be Tiffany's having the floor to discuss her theory, and then we will go on to a second part where we will have a little more, again, dialogic exchange and open up the ideas that were presented in the first half. So hopefully that flies with you guys in the audience, but I just wanted to sort of set this up. This is a little bit more different context or format, or however you want to say that, than other conversations. Thank you, Tiffany, for letting me get that disclaimer out there. I just think this is going to be the first time I've tried something like this, so I'm looking forward to it. But welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Yeah, when we spoke in our pre-meet and you presented your ideas, I was just like, wow, okay, this is interesting, and I want to see it. I want to be the observer, the person in the audience that sees this thing develop and as solid as it is, but I just see where it goes and when it gets into the world, and it's in its nascency right now, but just to get into the world is going to be fascinating. So I'm looking forward to being a passenger on that ride for you. Yeah. All right. So what might be good and is customary is we'll start with a little academic background or a little bits of personal stuff, whatever you want to share to get us to know you a little bit better. And then we can hop in to your theory, to Voss, and we'll go from there.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I earned my PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, where I studied something called the radical pair mechanism, which is a quantum mechanism believed to give birds, migratory birds, their ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field in order to navigate. And that mechanism actually is at the heart of the mechanism of consciousness or sort of agential thought that I'm proposing. And recently in 2024, I presented at the Science of Consciousness, which is hosted by the University of Arizona's Center for Consciousness Studies. I presented this mechanism at that conference. So I'm excited to get to share it with you. It's also the subject of a documentary that I produced that's just come out called Playing My Mind Symphony. And it's now streaming for free for anyone who wants a very sort of accessible sort of summary of the ideas that this mechanism is proposing and some of the consequences of it. And I really like to call it a mechanism of consciousness because we sort of have, and I'll go into what our sort of assumption about what thought is or how thought presents to us in terms of from a scientific perspective. What do we see as thought when we see thought in the brain or in any sort of biological systems? What do we see as agential thought or memory thought? And I'm not really a philosopher because I'm a physicist. I'm looking very much at, empirically, what do we see through experimentation and what conclusions can we draw from that? And I think the mechanism I'm proposing it's a mechanism for how agential thought arises, rather than sort of like a theory, a broad theory of consciousness. It's an actual physical mechanism by which what we see as thought in brain scans or in other biological organisms, how that information is actually arising in those biological systems, which is a fundamental question, right? I think, you might agree that the idea of what is consciousness, where does it come from, that sort of thing is really at the heart of what I'm interrogating. Yeah. So I think go ahead. I was just going to say, I think it's useful to start with, well, what do we know right now? Or what do we all assume right now thought is? From a neurological perspective, right? If you were to ask a neurologist, thought is essentially a voltage change in a neuron, right? When you have an action potential in a neuron and a neuron fires or it doesn't fire, that is essentially what thought is. And we know that there's good correlation. Even with just a simple EEG, we can extrapolate based on the sort of voltage map. If you take a snapshot or even a series over time of the voltage changes across various neurons, you can create sort of a dictionary of thought. You can reproduce the images that someone is seeing based on just EEG data. And what is EEG data? It's just looking at voltage changes, brainwave oscillations, which are just voltage changes across neurons, right? You can extrapolate language. You can extrapolate emotional state. You can extrapolate a lot of information that correlates with thought. So from a neurological perspective, we think of thought as a voltage change in neurons. But it goes deeper than that, because this sort of thought doesn't just occur in neuronal cells, but also in other cells within organisms. I'll mention Michael Levin's work, which shows that in a developing embryo, how do the cells that start off undifferentiated, how do they decide to differentiate into the various organs to form a body? When that information is not in the DNA of each of those cells. It turns out that each of those cells in the embryo gets a voltage instruction. And based on the voltage each cell has, that determines its destiny in terms of what tissue, what organ it's going to form. So his work raises the question of, well, where does the information for that voltage map come from if it's not encoded in DNA, which really just gives a blueprint for what proteins to create, not necessarily what gene regulation to execute to then determine, okay, this is going to be an eye cell, this is going to be a stomach cell, right? Even though they have the same genetic information in each of those two cells, the same genes aren't turned on, right? You want the genes that produce stomach acid to be turned on in stomach cells, but not in eye cells. That would be very bad. And so it's that voltage that the eye cell, say is 6 volts and the stomach cell is 3 volts. It's that voltage difference that then determines what that gene regulation is and what the cell is going to become. So much so that if experimenters alter the voltage of a particular cell, that was meant to be, say, a stomach cell or a tail cell in a frog or something like that. They could change that voltage to 6, and then another eye would grow there, and it would be a functioning eye, right? So the cells really are following this voltage map, but where the voltage map, again, I think of it as a thought, because it really is, it's a memory, right? So much so they've created two-headed flatworms, where just by changing that voltage map, where tail cells, they give those the voltage of head cells, then the next generation of flatworms then is two-headed. And that memory is preserved in subsequent generations. So you can think of the voltage map, the voltage that cells take on, as an anatomical memory. So here we have an idea that there's something about, well, what we see as a thought, or the information of thought, is really encapsulated in this, what I call a voltage map. Michael Levin, in his papers, it's called bioelectricity, right? And so the brain waves in the brain are just voltage changes that are happening more frequently, or on a time scale that's faster than, say, the anatomical voltage map, which is slower to develop. It's more static, because it represents a memory rather than sort of the thoughts we think of as agential thoughts. So the question is sort of, where does this voltage map come from? And then you can, in terms of anatomical memory, but you could ask a deeper question, well, where do our thoughts come from? Why do, where does our thinking come from? And I'm talking beyond just sort of the causal thoughts that you can trace to stimulus response. What about spontaneous thoughts? And is there any real agency or free will in choice that's coming in? So I would say that there's sort of two views on this. One view, sort of from a neurological perspective, is that consciousness is something that just emerges, or agency is something that just sort of emerges based on the sort of a networking perspective, where the number of nodes that you have, or the amount of circuitry that you have, and its arrangement, meaning the complexity of that circuitry, then becomes a function of the complexity of thought, or the complexity of information, that the information of thought or agency sort of arises the more complicated of a network that you have, whether that's an artificial network, whether that's a neuronal network, or even whether that's a gene regulatory network. I think another really interesting development from Michael Levin's group is that gene regulatory networks also are capable of associative learning. Now, associative learning, it's one of the best sort of empirical ways that we have of identifying agency in biological organisms, right? And what do we mean by agency? We mean this sort of goal-directed activity, sort of self-directed goal, preferences. When an obstacle is reached, an agent has the ability to overcome the obstacle in novel ways, not simply a way that is necessarily predicted by physics, right? A ball rolling down a hill, we can predict that path. It's not going to deviate from that because it chooses to, right? We can actually predict the path of inanimate objects. We think the difference with biological objects is there's some aspect of choice, agency, some aspect of non-calculability in what they're doing. And the idea is that that consciousness or that agency somehow arises from networking, right? The more cells you have, how those cells are communicating together, the complexity of those. But I want to point out that that is an assumption that we have. And that assumption often is taken as a fact, But I think it's important that we are very clear that that is an assumption, that sort of emergence, this idea that consciousness emerges from cellular complexity or network complexity. And I think there's some preliminary evidence that might call that into question. And I don't want to draw conclusions from someone else's work, but again, I'll point to Michael Levin's work on gene regulatory networks, where the biological networks exhibited associative learning. However, artificial gene regulatory networks with the same level of complexity, so the same number of nodes, if you will, did not generate the same level of associative learning that you had in gene regulatory networks. Now, so I think there's cause to question, well, if you have the same material and it's organized effectively the same way, it has the same level of network complexity, you would think that it would just give rise to the same level of consciousness, the same level of agency. And if it doesn't, that doesn't mean it can't. Maybe the right combination just hasn't been found, or maybe there's some other unknown factor that wasn't found yet. And maybe artificial networks will just have the same level of agency as the biological ones. But if not, then I think it opens the question, it allows us to maybe question that assumption as something that we don't know is fact. We don't know if network complexity gives rise to consciousness. And that is the mechanism I'm proposing, is a mechanism by which consciousness would not simply be emergent from the networking. So that's one sort of view on where consciousness comes from. And then there's a second view. So that was more sort of the biology, neurology view of where agency and consciousness sort of comes from. Then there's the physics view of where consciousness comes from. And that really is what I call sort of this a Darwinian evolutionary view, where there really is no agency, and what we see as the information of what seems like choices and free will thought is really more just a pattern in chaos, if you will. Sort of, just because you see evolution, it looks like there's intelligence behind it, but really it's just a logical consequence of random genetic mutations and natural selection based on the physics of various boundary conditions in the environment. Those are going to naturally select out certain genetic combinations. And so those organisms are just going to survive. And so there is no free will. It's all a deterministic cascade since the Big Bang. Deterministic, and depending on the interpretation of quantum mechanics that you follow, there are two, the Copenhagen and the Bohmian mechanics. Those are the two mathematical formalisms of quantum mechanics, I'll say. If you take, looking at the Copenhagen interpretation, if you're taking this idea that there are these sort of random jumps where you have this unpredictability, this probabilistic nature as well. But even there, that doesn't allow for free will because it's random, it's probabilistic. It's not like an agent is influencing the outcome of that probability distribution. And so in that case, what we see as agency is really just a pattern and a consequence of evolution. But I think there's cause to then question that assumption, right? Again, I'll go back to Michael Levin's work. You can see that I'm very much a fan of his work. It is quite groundbreaking because it really gets at the heart of these sort of assumptions that we have about biological organisms. And there's cause to question that evolutionary model, because we're seeing evidence of intelligence or thought or choices that are happening on non-evolutionary timescales, or what I call faster than evolutionary timescales. For example, there are flatworms where that live in an aqueous environment, if you add a certain element to the environment, barium, then their heads explode because, you know, it's not conducive to this agent. But these worms are regenerative, and so when their heads grow back, they find that they grow back with a resistance to this element. They're barium resistant. And that's in one generation. So if you were looking, the probability, the number of combinations of genetic mutations that one would have to go through to find the correct combination to be able to tolerate the new environment, from a probabilistic perspective, it's unlikely that that would be able to be achieved in one generation. So it's almost showing signs, in my conclusion, or the way I look at this, as the possibility that there is some level of intelligence or calculability or agency occurring on a timescale that isn't just a result of random genetic mutations that over time naturally select for a worm that would be able to adapt to this new environment, right? Because again, this is an environmental condition that these worms have never seen before. So it's not sort of some evolutionary memory that's then kicking in. This is a new evolutionary development. Another example would be sort of new organisms. Again, in Michael Levin's lab, they took skin cells from a frog and sort of collected them. And it wasn't clear what was going to happen to those skin cells, if they were, you know, what they were going to become, but they became these, what are called xenobots. They became sort of like a new novel organism that seems to have novel behaviors. I know that's an ongoing area of research, if those behaviors are truly agential or not. But the idea there is that these cells, from an evolutionary perspective, they were created, or they were, you know, they evolved to be frog cells, skin cells, right? They did not evolve to these other organisms that then collect cellular material to then create, sort of procreate, new xenobots, if you will. So we're seeing evidence of sort of intelligence emerging on timescales that are shorter than what would be explained by the standard random mutations, natural selection. So if that's the case, where would that information come from? And that's really where the mechanism I'm proposing is proposing where that information could come in, where this sort of free will agency could be interjected into a biological system, which at its core is based on physics. And we know all the subatomic particles, we know the laws of physics that those particles follow. And so most physicists would say there's no room for true agency to come into that because we know what the physics is. Everything is pretty much deterministic or within that probabilistic, but again, calculable because we know what those probability distributions are. And so what my mechanism of consciousness proposes is that any deviation from those probabilistic distributions that we have would in and of itself be a source of agency or true agency entering into a physical system. And so what my mechanism that I'm proposing is an actual mechanism by which that information can come into a physical biological system.
Independent of the boundaries or the constraints that you described in both probabilistic and distribution of probabilities, as well as the hard deterministic Laplacian demon kind of thing that they love to tout. And one amendment to the Levin's work with xenobots that I find fascinating is I believe when they extract those wild-type skin cells of Xenophus flavus is that they do a little ion channel tweaking to them so that they are wild-type collected, but then they are, if I could be wrong, that they are modified to some degree. That gives them that seeming agency and they can habitualize new behavior. And one thing though that I found fascinating in that work was that I think it's either kinematic or kenotaxic replication occurs, wherein the inert cells that are just scraped off a frog and thrown in that environment, that those activated cells, whatever they did with the bioelectricity or the voltage gating that goes on, is they then imbue upon the new cells that informational directive or whatever, what you've been describing. So I find that interesting that there is a gentle, I don't want to, it's like a teleonomy maybe, or even perhaps a kind of sense of purpose to having discovered, if they can have the capacity as the activated cell to see the inert cell, to say that, it's imperative that this cell in this environment, in order to survive in the environment, not just kind of dehydrate or die or, not metabolize anymore, right? So that there's that sort of informational pathway by kenotaxis or kenomatic. I can't remember the term, but it's keno something, right? So that just fascinates me. And then one thought to share with the audience is you mentioned your documentary. That link will be in the show notes, as will all of your information. So I just wanted to amend that. So I'll back off and let you continue. But yeah, Xenophus flavus.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think my recollection is I believe the first iteration of Genobots, if I'm not mistaken, was non-tweaked.
Okay.
Just to see. Cells. Just to see what would emerge. But I do know subsequent iterations, they are looking to sort of optimize.
Okay, good.
But don't quote me on that. We'd have to.
Right. No, but that's,
specifically, but that's a good question.
Right.
And I think really what it is it's raising this question, or at least in my mind, it's raising a question of the assumptions that we make, that consciousness is emergent from networking, or that consciousness is just a apparent pattern. Free will is an apparent pattern. Agency is an apparent pattern emerging in chaos. That's really just a consequence of random genetic mutations and natural selection. I think that sort of bedrock assumption that we have about consciousness is what my mechanism that I'm proposing is a way that would present an alternative to that assumption. And it really rests on sort of 4 pillars, which I'll sort of outline. And I'll go back to really the physics of the matter. If we're talking about true agency, how can true agency really arise, or free will arise, from a deterministic physical system? I mean, biological organisms are made up of subatomic particles, and we know how those subatomic particles behave, right? Especially if we're thinking, of associative learning in gene regulatory networks. Well, what are gene regulatory networks? They're really just collections of, molecules. We're really at pretty much the molecular level, right? So how could you see agency at that level? We're almost to the atomic level here, where we're saying that we're seeing this evidence of so-called agency. How could it give rise to sort of more information than the sum of its parts, if you will, in terms of the choices that are being made, survival choices that are being made, and the evolutionary changes that are happening on very short timescales, non-evolutionary timescales. And so one sort of the crux of VOSS is VOSS. It stands for vacuum orchestrated spin signaling. And what it's proposing is that the information of consciousness, the information of thought, is information in what's called the quantum vacuum. And so let's talk about what the quantum vacuum is. If all the atoms, the physical matter in our universe were to suddenly disappear, space would still not be empty. Space would be sort of percolating or bubbling. Think of it like a bubbling ocean or a waving ocean. Think of our three-dimensional space. It helps to think of it as a two-dimensional space, right? So think of it as a ocean bubbling or waving. And those sort of bubbles are what are called virtual particles popping in and out of existence constantly. And so we have the standard model of all the known particles, physical particles, as well as force-carrying particles that govern the interactions of those. So for simplicity, let's just take the example of an electron, right, as a physical particle. And let's take an example of a proton as a force-carrying particle or a virtual particle. So when you have two electrons, we know that, opposites attract. So an electron or a proton will attract, but two electrons will repel. And so how does that repulsion work? Quantum field theory tells us that the two electrons are exchanging virtual photons. That's what causes them to separate. You can think of you and I on a lake in rowboats and say I throw you a bowling ball, right? You catch it and we move apart, right? That's sort of how it works. Okay. That bowling ball is like a virtual photon.
Okay.
And how is a virtual photon different from a regular photon, like the lights we have on in the room, right? Like those are electromagnetic waves or photons. Well, virtual particles, again, they have a shorter lifetime, governed by something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So the more energy it has, right, like a blue photon, right, will have more energy than a red photon. And so it'll last, blue photon will last a much shorter period of time than a red photon. So that's proportional to Planck's constant. So these virtual photons, they're not measurable. They're force carriers. But we do know they exist, right, from various experiments like the Casimir effect, where you hold two plates together, very close together. And each photon, the blue photon has wavelengths that are shorter than a red photon, right? It's going to have a long wavelength. And if you imagine all the different photons, all the different colors, which are only differ by their wavelength, if you hold plates together, the space between those plates can be so small that only the shortest wavelengths of photons can exist. And the longer wavelengths of photons can exist. So because there's more photons on the outside of the plates than on the insides of the plates, you have a attractive force where the plates are pulled together. So that's one sort of experiment where we see the effects of these virtual photons. And so why does this matter? Well, within the past 2 decades or so, there's been a new field of physics that's emerged called relativistic quantum information. And they're really exploring the quantum vacuum and the properties of the quantum vacuum. And one of the interesting properties that they've discovered is that the quantum vacuum is this infinitely entangled structure and a store of information. And so that's the crux of what I'm proposing, is that the information that is thought, the information behind thought, the information of the voltage map, that is arising from the quantum vacuum, that is where the information is. And then I'm proposing a mechanism by which that's communicated to cells in terms of what voltage they should take at any point in time. And in relativistic quantum information, they're discovering that some very interesting properties about the quantum vacuum. And when I say that the vacuum is infinitely entangled, what does that mean? Well, let's explain sort of entanglement. And actually, before we get into that, I do want to back up, because I said before that the issue of could true agency come into a physical system when we know the physics of how those subatomic particles interact, right? We know that the electrons are going to separate through the exchange of virtual photons. We can calculate that. We know what that is. We know how those subatomic particles are going to interact. So how could any free will agency arise from something that's completely calculable? And so again, I say, well, any slight deviation from what is calculable would constitute agency or free will thought. And by definition, any deviation from that. And so we have a series of experiments that suggest that thought actually does cause these virtual particles to deviate from their calculable behavior according to the standard model, according to quantum field theory. And so, again, if you think of the best way to think of this is if you have the quantum vacuum and you have these virtual, again, photons, virtual particles, virtual photons popping in and out of existence all the time. You can think of that behavior as random, right? So the colors, the frequency of those particles or the wavelength of those particles, the energy of those particles and the time that they exist, it's all random. Except for when you place two electrons in the space and then suddenly the behavior of those virtual photons changes in a way, right? It changes where on average, the exchange of those virtual photons are going to separate the electrons. And even that is sort of a weighted average of a probability distribution where one electron could exchange a proton with the other electron, but in between that electron could break into different particles and then recombine into a photon. You know, there are a myriad of ways that that exchange can occur. And how that's calculated, you've probably seen those Feynman diagrams of all the different particle interactions. Mm-hmm. And so you take all the possible interactions and there's a weighted average, meaning the more complex the interaction, the less likely it is to occur. And when you have that weighted average, on average, electrons separate. But there is an interaction where they come together, right? Mm-hmm. It's just on average, they separate. And so particle interactions are, again, this probability distribution that is calculable as per quantum field theory. Any deviation from that, I'm proposing any deviation that is not random, but is informational, right? Any deviation that's not just a random deviation, but informational in one particular direction, that constitutes information. And I'm saying that that's the information of thought, that that deviation is in of itself the source of agency or an evidence of agency by definition. Mm-hmm. So there's an experiment that suggests that this could be happening. And it is a psychokinesis experiment, which these experiments were originally began, I think in the late 70s, 1970s or early 80s at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. The head of their engineering department was doing these experiments with random number generators that were based on some sort of quantum process. So the randomness was based on some sort of quantum process. And they were looking to see if people with their thoughts or their minds could influence a random outcome. So think a coin flip. It should be 50% heads, 50% tails. Could you, with your mind, switch it to be more heads or more tails? So they did decades of these experiments, and they claimed to have statistically significant results. But those results were very weak. So it was very easy to sort of ignore that work and kind of question it. And that's true with all sorts of experiments in this sort of category of parapsychology. The field is largely dismissed, I'd say, for three main reasons. One, the effect sizes are very small, right? Okay. Yes, you do many, many trials, and it appears that someone was able to nudge the coin flip a little bit more, more heads than tails. But depending on your statistical analysis and parsing, there could be an argument made that, well, maybe that really isn't a significant effect.
Yeah.
So effect size was always in question. The second thing was reproducibility, right? Now, part of that is there's not a lot of funding for that kind of research. So there aren't a lot of, there's not a lot of credibility in this field. So why would anyone of any serious stature sort of look to reproduce that work? And then the third thing is just that it kind of justifies basic logic. Again, going back to our basic understanding of physics, there is no way, there is no physical mechanism by which thought could deviate quantum phenomena in any sort of way that we would understand in physics. So recently, Morris Friedman did a sort of new version of this experiment where at least two of these issues, the reproducibility and the effect size, seem to have been improved quite dramatically. And what he proposed is that, based on other research, that he had this idea that there were certain processes within the brain that somehow shielded the mind in some way, or shielded thought from affecting other systems. And that kind of seems logical. Think of the brain. If consciousness isn't emerging, think of the brain. What if the brain was receiving a signal? What if the brain was like an antenna, where consciousness isn't emerging from the network of the neurons, but is somehow that the brain is somehow a receiver, an antenna, and is actually receiving a signal. And if you think of it that way, my cell phone, your cell phone, I wouldn't want to be getting your signal. You wouldn't want to be getting my signal. There must be some calibration where only a very particular stream of information is being received by a particular receiver. And anything, at the Science of Consciousness conference, one scientist said, if any sort of parapsychology were real, why don't we see it more? Why would it be so hard to measure? Why are the effect sizes so small? And the reason, and the answer was, well, it should be, right? Because if you do see any sort of, I'll say, entanglement between a mind and a physical system, or a mind and another mind, that would be anomalous. It would be something's broken down. And so Morris Friedman, that's what he did is he broke down, they sort of determined what sort of region of the brain they needed to break down or disable, and to get a stronger effect size. And so what they used is this sort of these magnetic coils. And I'm forgetting the exact, RTMS. So these are magnetic coils that are used in therapies like OCD or post-traumatic stress disorder, to sort of alleviate those systems. And they create sort of a temporary lesion in a certain region of the brain where they're utilized, sort of disrupting the function of that region of the brain. And when they did that, what they found is this ability of the mind to affect this coin flip, this random number generator, increased fourfold, I believe. I have to check the exact amount. But the significance dramatically improved. And the reproducibility was also there, meaning that they were able to reproduce the results four times. And so if you look closely at what this experiment is suggesting, and it really is just a preliminary suggestion, but it's suggesting the possibility that thought deviates quantum vacuum fluctuations, deviates the behavior of these virtual photons slightly, a slight deviation from what would be predicted by the standard physics model of quantum, the standard model in quantum field theory. Because the random number generators are based on something called electron tunneling. So if you think of, there are really nice ways of visualizing quantum physics from the perspective of the pilot wave interpretation. So the Copenhagen interpretation, of course, associates a wave function to a particle. So if you have two slits, right, the double slit experiment, which you're probably familiar with, and you send electrons through the double slits, it could go through the right slit, the left slit, right? And in the Copenhagen mathematics, you send the electron, you sort of, if you want to reproduce what is the pattern you're going to see on a screen after the electron goes through the slits, you sum all the possibilities. You sum the electron going through the right slit, the left slit, and both slits, right? All of these combinations, sort of like I told you about the interactions between the electrons. You have all those possible combination of interactions. You sum that up, and you can reproduce the pattern on the back of the screen. Now, the Copenhagen interpretation doesn't say that the particle actually becomes a wave. It doesn't say that the electron becomes a wave, goes through the slits, and then collapses into a particle when it hits the screen, right? That's just the mathematics that we use to model and reproduce the distribution that we see on the screen. But a lot of people have sort of then taken that to say, well, maybe that's what is physically happening. Maybe a particle has this wave-particle duality and becomes a wave and becomes a particle. And there's this randomness to that. The pilot wave interpretation is, or Bohmian mechanics, is a completely equivalent mathematical formulation, but instead the particle follows the sort of classical trajectory, the classical equations of physics, but it's being guided by a wave. And the wave function is assigned to this wave, this guiding wave, or the pilot wave. And the pilot wave extends throughout the entire universe. And so you can see a lot of videos of oil droplets, which actually mimic a lot of the phenomena that we see that seem mysterious in quantum mechanics. But when you demonstrate it with an analog of these oil droplets, then you can see how the pilot wave theory is a way of actually making sense of what physically might be happening. And again, the pilot wave theory is you have an electron. It's always an electron. It doesn't change into a particle, but it's being guided by a wave, right? And so that's why you see this interference pattern or this wave pattern when the collection of electrons hit the back screen in the double slit experiment. And so the what's happening there then is in relativistic quantum information, we're sort of starting to see in a way the nature of the pilot wave is experimentally is actually we're actually kind of discovering that the nature of the pilot wave sort of mimics the nature of virtual particles. And there's actually some papers that suggest that the pilot wave could be these virtual particle fluctuations. So again, I think that ocean analogy is very useful to have in mind, where these waves popping in and out of existence are like these virtual photons popping out of existence. Again, they're random, except in the case when particles, two electrons are there, and then their behavior changes to separate, right? So what I'm saying is in this random number generator, the random number generator is based on electron tunneling. So you can see videos of this, again, with the oil droplets, where you have an oil bath where there's a sound vibration underneath that's vibrating. And then you have one droplet that represents the electron, and then the guiding wave that's vibrating underneath it. So you can think of the guiding wave as the virtual photons, and you can think of the electron as sort of dancing atop these virtual photons that are sort of moving it around. So in electron tunneling, what you have is you have an electron that's sort of trapped in a well. Think of a petri dish, right? Think of a skillet. Think of a frying pan skillet with a low rim, and it's filled almost to the brim with oil, and the oil is bubbling, and you have maybe a popcorn kernel that's sort of dancing around these oil droplets. So the popcorn kernel is the electron, and the bubbling oil is the virtual photons. But there's a barrier. The popcorn kernel can't get out of the frying pan unless every now and then the bubbling has enough energy, right, to pop it out of the barrier for it to escape the barrier. So it's called tunneling. It's called tunneling through an energy barrier where the electron can escape an energy barrier. And that's a function of these virtual particles. Well, essentially in this psychokinesis experiment, what it's suggesting is that thought or mind or consciousness is able to slightly perturb the activity of those virtual particles. Because the random number generators are generally, they're the one that was used, is based on quantum tunneling where you create a binary outcome. So how do you get a coin flip, heads, tails, from electron tunneling? Well, what you can do is you can take time between tunneling events, and you can ask, is the time between this current tunneling event and the last tunneling event, is it greater than or less than the tunneling event before? So that greater than less than creates a binary outcome that is the function of a completely random quantum fluctuations. It's a function of the random fluctuation of those virtual particles. And so what this experiment is suggesting is that thought can perturb slightly the behavior of those virtual particles from that probabilistic distribution that we would otherwise predict, right? If we were to model the electron tunneling, right, the electron's behavior and the electron's interaction with these virtual particles, we would have one sort of prediction of sort of what over time those electron tunneling events would be. But in this psychokinesis experiment, we're suggesting that thought is able to perturb the behavior of those virtual particles slightly to sort of skew the results of that from what otherwise would be. So what I'm proposing from this experiment is that that's what thought does. It's somehow information that skews the behavior of these virtual particles. So is there a mechanism that could explain this experiment? That's really what VOS is. It's called vacuum orchestrated spin signaling. And I'll just summarize it in general. What I'm proposing is that the information of thought, or the agency and the actual process of cognition, at least executive cognition, is taking place in what's called the quantum vacuum. And then that information is communicated via these virtual particles, or is signaled via these virtual particles to quantum antenna in our cells known as radical pairs. And those radical pairs then control the ion channel opening and closing that then determines the voltage that we see in cells. So that's the sort of through line. The question is there evidence for each part of this mechanism? And there actually is. So if we start with relativistic quantum information, again, what we find is that, as I mentioned, that sort of pilot wave theory of quantum mechanics, the reason the pilot wave theory, I think, was sort of rejected and the Copenhagen interpretation was preferred is really two. One, the mathematics is just a little bit simpler. It's just a little bit simpler to just have one wave function associated with the particle versus you have the particle function a classic function, and then you have the wave function that's guiding it. That's just a little bit more mathematically cumbersome, even though both mathematical formulations give the exact same predictions. Mm-hmm. They're completely different. But the other reason is that at the time that it was proposed, the biggest problem with quantum mechanics was that it didn't reconcile with relativity. Where in and the issue was the non-locality of quantum mechanics. This phenomenon of quantum entanglement was the issue. And so in the Copenhagen interpretation, the entanglement is isolated to particles or individual particles, whereas in the pilot wave theory, the entire pilot wave extending throughout the entire universe is entangled. So it just seems like if entanglement is an issue, you'd want to minimize it, right? As you're trying to reconcile your quantum theory with relativity. So it's important to understand then just, well, what do we mean by entanglement? And so before relativistic quantum information, if we wanted to create entangled particles, like one way we would do it is, say, from energy, we know E equals mc squared. You can create particles from energy. That's what the quantum vacuum is doing with virtual particles. And for conservation of angular momentum, if you create particles from energy, which has zero angular momentum, the particles have to have opposite spins, right? Either spin up, spin down, or you could say spin left, spin right, Depending on how you measure the orientation in which you measure spin. Mm-hmm. So when you create two particles, they have to have this correlation. And the sort of mystery comes in when you create two particles, you don't know what their spin is. You don't know how you're going to measure their spin, either vertically or horizontally. But you don't perform that measurement. You separate those particles anywhere in the universe, and then you decide what measurement you're going to perform. Are you going to perform it vertically or horizontally, right? And once you make that decision, the particles are always going to be opposite to one another. But if you measure vertically and this one spin up and this one spin down, if you then measure horizontally, there's still a 50-50 chance of which one would be left, right, or right, left, right? And so because you don't know what measurement you're going to take, and because the result is always 50-50, depending on which measurement you do, it's not as if the particles are created where this one is always going to be spin up and this one is always going to be spin down. No, if we measure vertically, right, and then if we measure horizontally and then we measure vertically, there's still a 50-50 chance. It could be either way. So there's no predetermination of what the spin is going to be. And yet, when they're apart, how can they be coordinated? How can they be opposite? Mm-hmm. And so it seems like communication at faster than light speed, right? Mm-hmm. Which contradicts relativity. The way around this was that, yes, but these particles had to be created locally. And so because they were created locally, you don't have that sort of issue of communication, faster than light speed communication. Well, that was changed again with the recent experiments in relativistic quantum information, or RQI. What they're finding is that if you have two quantum objects, it's called an unruh DeWitt detector, which is basically, think of a quantum object that has two states, two energy states, right? A binary outcome. That quantum detector can harvest entanglement from the quantum vacuum. Because again, I mentioned the quantum vacuum is infinitely entangled, sort of like what Bohm predicted of the pilot wave, that it's infinitely entangled throughout the entire universe. And one detector can become so if you have two detectors far apart, they weren't created together, they've never come in contact with one another, they can actually become entangled via the entanglement of the vacuum. It's called entanglement harvesting. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a mechanism by which one quantum object can become entangled with another quantum object and can actually obtain information about the other quantum object. So really what this shows is there's an ability of information transfer from the quantum vacuum to the quantum object. And this has been done experimentally. So what I'm proposing is that in biological systems, the quantum object could be a radical pair, which is a quantum object. You can think of it as a quantum antenna. It exists in all cells. And that this radical pair could be entangled could harvest entanglement from the quantum vacuum. And that information, the quantum vacuum is a store of information. Again, one detector can get information about the other because you can think of the quantum vacuum almost like the pilot wave, or the virtual particle fluctuations as the pilot wave, and the information behind that is in the quantum vacuum. In Bohmian mechanics, the reason our quantum experiments seem random, unlike the Copenhagen interpretation, the pilot wave theory is deterministic. The only reason we can't sort of calculate trajectories and they appear probabilistic is that we don't have full information on the initial conditions, because as one particle changes its state, the entire pilot wave updates with that information, the entire pilot wave throughout all the universe. And so if you wanted to predict the trajectory of one electron through the slits, you would need to know the initial state of every particle in the universe, because the pilot wave is updating instantaneously with information about every particle in the universe. So you can think of the pilot wave as the store of information. And that's what I'm proposing the information of thought is coming from, is from this store of information. And that it's communicated via virtual particle fluctuations, via virtual photon fluctuations to radical pairs. So the last thing that we need to talk about is this radical pair mechanism. We know that the radical pairs are sensitive to photon pulses. They're sensitive to magnetic fields as well. Within the range of virtual photons that correspond to their lifetime. And let me just explain what the radical pair sort of well, before I do that, I'll just also say that we also know that radical pairs have been implicated in consciousness as well, meaning that there's been some research to suggest that the disabling of the radical pair mechanism is how general anesthetics work. So that would make sense if the radical pairs are this antenna that are receiving a signal of information from the quantum vacuum, that disabling that antenna would then cut off consciousness. And also that those radical pairs are also implicated in the products of radical pair reactions can control ion channel gating. So we do have that through line. And I can explain what a radical pair actually is. And it's very simple. Let's say you have two atoms, and we know that the number of electrons and protons are balanced. The number of protons in the nucleus and the number of electrons should be balanced when you have a neutral atom. Through the process of metabolism, an oxidative process, you have these radical pairs that are created. Okay? And so one electron from one atom would be donated to another electron. So now you have an electron imbalance, which creates a net spin for each electron. And because of the way that they're created in a way that the spins are entangled. So that's why the radical pair is then a quantum object. And over the lifetime of this radical pair, because eventually the donated electron will go back to its parent electron. But over the course of its lifetime, these two spins are sensitive to magnetic field changes in orientation. That's been verified in vitro, which is why it's the basis of sort of the chemical compass, how we think birds are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field, because these spins are sensitive to magnetic field orientation. They're also sensitive to photon pulses. And so what I'm proposing is that they're sensitive to variations or changes in the virtual photons. And so over the course of their lifetime, if the orientation starts parallel, any perturbation will change that orientation of those electron spins. And so you have sort of this binary antenna where if it's over its lifetime, if it's just random, then again, you have this sort of 50-50 coin toss, right? However, if you perturb that, then you can have one state more than the other. And depending on the state, at the end of the radical pair lifetime, depending on which state it's in, where the spins are parallel or anti-parallel, you're going to have different reaction products. You're going to have a different signal, which then can control an ion channel. You can think of it as opening the ion channel or closing the ion channel, causing a neuron to fire or not causing a neuron to fire. So you have sort of a correlation between, again, the orientation of this radical pair over its lifetime and then the resulting voltage change that you might see within a cell. And so that's really the through line of what this vacuum orchestrated spin signaling is. I'm saying that agency that we're seeing, we're seeing this agency of associative learning not only in plants and animals and gene regulatory networks, which are essentially collections of molecules. I'm proposing that it's sort of like a Lego analogy, that consciousness, the agency we see isn't emerging from the Legos assembling themselves into these interesting things and doing these interesting things, that there is some force that is more fundamental that is moving those pieces. So that the consciousness isn't emerging from the physical pieces. The consciousness is actually a force moving those physical pieces. And that the information of that consciousness and that thought, those thoughts, are in the information field of the quantum vacuum, which we know is an entangled field of information. And that information is being signaled via virtual particle fluctuations and deviations, perturbations of those virtual particle fluctuations, perturbing the radical pairs, which act as a quantum detector, coupling with the entangled quantum vacuum. And then that then controls, to some extent, the voltage activity that we see in cells. So that's the outline of the theory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And are you comfortable now? We'll stop this conversation and then we'll go more into a little back and forth and ask a couple questions and open things up that you've presented. Is that good?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So what I'll do in the magic of video production is I'll just stop record, say goodbye to the YouTube audience for part 1. Please come back to part 2. I think I'm going to load them up back to back on the same day and not do this whole wait a week or whatever. So they'll come out concomitantly, and that way you can continue this. So let me just go ahead and hit stop record, and then we'll just resume recording. Okay. All right. So bye bye for chapter 1, and we'll see you in chapter 2.